The city pulsed with life, a rhythm of movement and sound that never truly stopped. The afternoon sun cast long shadows against the pavement as people hurried through the streets, lost in their own routines. Conversations blended into the hum of traffic, the occasional honk of impatient drivers cutting through the air. It was an ordinary day, the kind no one expected to remember. But within moments, that would change. Among the crowd was a young boy, no older than 10, making his way home from school. His clothes were worn but clean, an old t-shirt that had faded over time, jeans that had seen their fair share of playground scrapes, and sneakers scuffed at the toes from days of running, jumping, and simply being a kid. He did not stand out. He was just another face in the crowd, another child navigating a world that often overlooked him. As he moved through the streets, his mind drifted. He thought about what he would eat when he got home, about the math homework stuffed in his backpack, about how the heat of the pavement warmed his worn-out shoes. He had no idea that, in a few short seconds, everything around him would shift. A car sat at the top of a small incline, parked on the side of the road. It looked no different from the hundreds of others that lined the street until it moved. Slowly, at first, so imperceptible that no one noticed. Then, as if gaining confidence in its escape, it began to roll faster, its tires inching forward without a driver behind the wheel. The boy caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. At first, he thought nothing of it. But as his gaze followed the car's path, realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. The vehicle, gaining momentum with every second, was headed straight for the crosswalk. Pedestrians strolled across the street unaware of what was coming. A mother pushed a stroller, her attention focused on her baby. An older man walked with a cane, his steps careful and slow. A group of teenagers chatted loudly, oblivious to the danger barreling toward them. No one saw it. No one except the boy. His heart pounded against his ribs. Time felt different now, stretched thin between the seconds, as if daring him to act. He glanced around, expecting someone, anyone, to notice. But people were lost in their own worlds, too distracted, too unaware. It was just him. He could feel the moment hanging in the air, balanced on the edge of a decision. His feet felt frozen for a split second, his mind screaming that this was not his problem, that someone else should step in. But the truth settled deep in his chest. There was no one else. It had to be him. And before he could talk himself out of it, he ran. The boy had never known an easy life. He had grown up in a world where nothing was guaranteed, where struggle was a part of every day, and where survival often depended on resilience rather than luck. His family did what they could to make ends meet, but there were nights when the fridge was nearly empty, and mornings when the weight of unpaid bills filled the air like an unspoken burden. Yet, despite it all, he never let his circumstances define him. He had learned early on that kindness was not something you needed money to give. Even when he had little, he found ways to help those who had even less. If a friend forgot their lunch at school, he would split his own, no matter how small. If an elderly neighbor needed groceries carried up the stairs, he would do it without being asked. He did not do it for recognition or rewards. He did it because it was right. But life had also taught him hard lessons. He had seen people walk past others in need without a second glance. He had watched as his mother struggled to be heard when she asked for help, ignored by those who lived in comfort. He understood that in a world where some had everything and others barely scraped by, people like him were often invisible. And yet, Despite the way the world had treated him, he refused to turn cold. He refused to become someone who only looked out for himself. Even at 10 years old, he knew that bravery was not just about being strong, it was about choosing to care, even when no one else did. Far from where the boy walked, another life moved on in stark contrast. The car's owner, a middle-aged businessman, had built his life on success. He had worked hard, climbed the ranks, and now lived comfortably in a world where everything seemed to go his way. His days were filled with meetings, phone calls, and tight schedules. His time was money, and every moment counted. He had parked his car earlier that day in his usual hurried fashion, already thinking ahead to his next destination. His mind was occupied with deadlines and profits, with upcoming deals and power lunches. He barely remembered turning off the ignition, let alone whether he had secured the parking brake. It was a mistake, but not one he had ever needed to worry about before. He had lived a life where things simply worked out. Problems were inconveniences that someone else usually handled. He had never thought about the small, careless moments, the ones that could spiral into something much bigger. But now, that small mistake had set something into motion. The car, parked on a subtle incline, had started its slow descent. The businessman was nowhere in sight, oblivious to the fact that his luxury vehicle was no longer where he had left it. He had moved on with his day, confident that everything was as it should be. Meanwhile, back on the street, the boy's eyes remained fixed on the moving car, its speed increasing with each passing second. The pedestrians at the crosswalk had no idea of the danger heading their way. The businessman, the one person who could have prevented this, was long gone. It was the perfect example of how the world often worked. Those with the power to stop things before they spiraled out of control were too distracted, too disconnected. And those who had nothing, the ones struggling just to get by, were left to pick up the pieces. The boy could have ignored it. He could have walked away like so many others might have. But that was not who he was. He had spent his entire life watching people hesitate, watching them choose not to act. And he had promised himself that if he ever had the chance to do the right thing, he would not be like them. He did not have wealth. He did not have influence, but in that moment, he had something more important. He had a choice. And he chose to run. The world around him seemed to slow, yet his heart pounded faster than it ever had before. The boy's feet moved before his mind could catch up, instincts taking over as he lunged forward. His legs pumped hard against the pavement, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he raced toward the runaway car. It was moving faster now, rolling downhill with a quiet but menacing momentum. The pedestrians in its path remained oblivious, chatting, scrolling through their phones, pushing strollers and carrying groceries as if disaster were not seconds away from striking. The car picked up speed, its silent descent turning dangerous with each passing moment. No one saw it. No one but him. He pushed himself harder, weaving through the crowd, dodging moving bodies as he aimed straight for the rolling vehicle. He had no plan, no time to think. He only knew that if he did not do something, someone, maybe multiple people, would get hurt. The car was inches from the crosswalk when he finally reached it. With everything he had, he threw his small frame against the driver's side door, his shoulders slamming into the heavy metal with a force that sent shock waves through his body. The impact jolted him, pain rippling through his arm, but he ignored it. He braced himself, planting his feet firmly against the ground, his hands grasping at the handle, his entire body pushing back against the force of the moving vehicle. But it was stronger than him. The momentum dragged him forward, his sneakers skidding against the asphalt as the weight of the car threatened to overpower him. His muscles burned, but he clenched his teeth, refusing to let go. The thought of what would happen if he failed, the sound of the impact, the cries of unsuspecting pedestrians, the shattering of glass and bones drove him to push even harder. He screamed through gritted teeth, using every ounce of strength in his small body. His legs trembled, but his resolve did not waver. The car fought back, resisting him like an unstoppable force, but the boy had faced bigger struggles in life. He had faced hunger, cold nights, and an indifferent world. He had learned how to fight when the odds were against him. And today would be no different. With one final, desperate push, he threw his weight against the car, his body acting as the last barrier between disaster and safety. His heels dug into the pavement, and for a brief, terrifying moment he thought it would not be enough. Then, finally, the car began to slow. His muscles screamed in protest, his breaths ragged, but the force against him was fading. Inch by inch, the vehicle came to a stop, resting mere inches from the crosswalk. The pedestrians, still lost in their routines, had no idea how close they had come to tragedy. For a second, the boy remained pressed against the door, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his body trembling from the effort. His vision swam, his arms ached, but he had done it. He had stopped it. A murmur ran through the crowd as people began to notice. A woman turned, her brow furrowed as she pointed at the boy, confusion in her eyes. A man followed her gaze, his expression shifting from curiosity to realization. One by one, heads turned, voices rising in astonishment. Did that kid just... That car was moving. Was he stopping it? The energy in the air shifted, rippling through the crowd like a slow-moving wave. What had once been an ordinary afternoon was now charged with something different, something extraordinary. People rushed forward, drawn to the boy standing breathless beside the car. A hand landed on his shoulder, another reaching out as if unsure whether to comfort or simply confirm that he was real. "What happened?" someone asked. "Are you okay?" The boy swallowed hard, still catching his breath, still trying to process what had just happened. He glanced toward the crosswalk, where people continued walking, oblivious to the fact that, if he had been a second too late, their lives might have changed forever. But he had been fast enough. He had been strong enough. What would you do in a moment like this? Would you have been brave enough to step in? And where are you watching from? What's the time in your city? Let us know in the comments and share your thoughts. The scene at the intersection was still buzzing with energy. People murmured in disbelief, their voices layered with admiration and awe as they continued to process what had just unfolded before their eyes. A child, a boy who, minutes ago, had been just another passerby, had stopped a runaway car with nothing but his sheer determination. Then, the sound of hurried footsteps approached. The owner of the car, a sharply dressed businessman, wove his way through the crowd. His mind had been occupied with a million things that day: meetings, deadlines, financial reports. But none of it mattered now. The moment he caught sight of his car, parked at an awkward angle just inches from the crosswalk, his heart nearly stopped. But what truly shook him was the small figure standing beside it. The boy. He was breathing heavily, his body still recovering from the exertion, his hands resting on his knees. His worn-out sneakers were planted firmly on the ground, and his shirt clung to his back with sweat. The boy had just saved his car. More importantly, He had saved people from what could have been a tragic accident. The businessman, for the first time in a long time, was speechless. He had lived a life where problems were solved with money, where risks were calculated, and where disasters were avoided with well-placed decisions. But this was something else. This boy had risked his life. For what? For strangers. For a car that did not belong to him? He took a step forward, his gaze locked onto the boy, his voice struggling to find the right words. "You stopped the car?" The boy lifted his head, meeting the businessman's gaze with wide, uncertain eyes. He gave a small nod, as if he did not fully understand why this man was looking at him with such disbelief. The businessman exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't even know what to say. He was a man who always had the right thing to say in a boardroom, who could command attention with his speeches and negotiations. But in this moment, standing before this boy who had just risked everything without a second thought, words failed him. His gratitude felt small, insignificant, compared to what the boy had just done. "Thank you," he said finally, but it felt inadequate. "You saved a lot of people today." The boy simply shrugged, his posture still uncertain. It was the right thing to do. The businessman let out a breath, shaking his head in amazement. He had spent his entire life making deals, ensuring his wealth and power remained intact. He had surrounded himself with people who acted only when there was something to gain. Yet, standing before him was a child, someone who had nothing, yet had given everything in a single moment of courage. And suddenly, he knew that just thanking him was not enough. He straightened, clearing his throat before addressing the boy again. "Listen," he said, his voice steady now. "I don't just want to thank you. I want to do something for you." The boy blinked, confusion flickering in his dark eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean," the businessman continued, "I want to help you. You risked your life today, not for attention, not for a reward, but because you believed it was the right thing to do. That kind of bravery, that kind of selflessness. It deserves more than just a thank you." The boy hesitated, not sure where this was going. The businessman took a deep breath before saying the words that would change everything. "I want to offer you a scholarship to one of the best schools in the city. I'll cover everything, your education, your books, your future. And if you ever need guidance, I'll be there to mentor you." Silence fell over the street. The boy's breath caught in his throat. He had spent his entire life just trying to get by, surviving day by day, never daring to hope for more. And now, in the wake of a single act of bravery, he was being offered something beyond his wildest dreams. His fingers clenched into the fabric of his shirt. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The businessman knelt slightly, lowering himself to the boy's level. "Because the world needs people like you," he said honestly, "and because you deserve it." The boy swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had never been given anything for free. He had never thought he would be seen as anything more than just another kid trying to make it through another day. But today had changed everything. A simple act of courage had rewritten the course of his life. And for the first time, he dared to believe in something bigger than just survival. The boy's life had never been one of grandeur or recognition. He had walked the same streets every day, unnoticed by the world around him, just another child trying to make it through. But today was different. Today, the world had seen him, not as a nameless face in the crowd, not as just another kid on his way home from school, but as something more, a hero. Word of his actions spread like wildfire. The people, who had stood frozen in shock only moments ago, were now recounting the event to anyone who would listen. Strangers stopped him on the street, their faces filled with awe and admiration. Some shook his hand, others simply offered words of gratitude. "You saved lives today," a woman said, her voice thick with emotion. A man in a suit patted his shoulder, shaking his head in amazement. "That was real bravery, son." He did not know how to respond. He had never done anything for attention before. He had never expected a reward. But now, the world around him had shifted, and with it, the way people looked at him. That night, as he sat at the worn kitchen table in his small home, he turned the business card over in his fingers. The businessman had given it to him before leaving, a symbol of an offer that still felt too surreal to be true. A scholarship, a future, a chance at something more than just surviving day by day. His mother sat across from him, her hands folded together, her eyes filled with emotions she struggled to put into words. She had always told him to be kind, to do the right thing even when no one was watching. And now, that kindness had come back to him in a way neither of them could have ever imagined. "Are you sure about this?" she asked gently, though he could hear the hope in her voice. He looked down at the card, then back at her. "I think I have to try," he said. The next few days were a whirlwind. The businessman kept his promise. Calls were made, arrangements put in place. Within a week, the boy was standing in front of a school he never thought he would enter. The large gates, the pristine hallways, the quiet hum of students discussing things he had never even dreamed of learning. It was a world entirely unfamiliar to him. And yet, it was his now. People still talked about him, still whispered when he walked by. "That's the kid from the news," they would say. But he didn't let it overwhelm him. He wasn't here because of a headline. He was here because he had made a choice to act when no one else did. His first day was difficult. The lessons were harder than he was used to, the environment intimidating. But he had never been one to back down from a challenge. He had faced the streets, hunger, the cold nights when hope felt impossible. Compared to that, this was something he could handle. The businessman kept his second promise, too. He met with the boy regularly, offering guidance, checking in on his progress. At first, the boy didn't know what to say to him. They came from two different worlds, one of power and privilege, the other of struggle and survival. But slowly, a connection formed. The businessman was no longer just a stranger who had made an offer. He became a mentor, someone who believed in him. As the weeks passed, the boy adjusted to his new life. He worked harder than ever, determined not to waste the opportunity given to him. But he never forgot where he came from. He never stopped being the person who had stepped in when no one else would. The community, too, never forgot him. His story continued to inspire others. People who had once overlooked him now saw him in a new light. The nameless child had become a symbol of courage, a reminder that heroism did not come from power or status. It came from the heart. And as he sat in his new classroom, pencil in hand, staring at the blank pages of a book filled with possibilities, he realized something. This was just the beginning, a new chapter, a new journey, and he was ready. The world had always been a place of struggle for the boy. Each day had been a test of endurance, a quiet battle against circumstances beyond his control. He had never asked for more than what he had, never dared to dream beyond what life had given him. But now, everything had changed. The city still moved at its usual fast pace. its streets filled with people too busy to notice the small details of life. But for him, life no longer felt like an endless cycle of survival. What had begun as just another day had transformed into something he never could have imagined. It had started with a runaway car. It had started with a single moment, a decision to act when no one else did. And now, that moment had rewritten his entire future. Sitting at his new desk in his new school, he stared down at the books in front of him. They were filled with possibilities, pages upon pages of knowledge that he had never thought would be his to explore. A few weeks ago, the idea of attending a school like this would have been nothing more than a dream, something meant for other kids, kids who never had to wonder where their next meal would come from, or whether they would have a place to sleep at night. But now, he was one of them. He wasn't sure if he belonged just yet. The halls felt unfamiliar, the lessons more difficult than he was used to. But he had never been one to give up. He had faced harder things in life. And if he had learned anything from that day on the street, it was that bravery wasn't about being fearless. It was about acting, even when the odds were stacked against you. And he was ready to fight for this new future. Across town, the businessman, the car's owner, sat in his office, staring out the window, lost in thought. His life had always been dictated by numbers, deals, and power. He had spent years believing that success was measured by how much you owned, by how high you could climb. But after that day, his perspective had shifted. For the first time, he had truly understood that status meant nothing when compared to character. He had seen courage in its purest form, not in the boardrooms he had spent his life in, not in the powerful people he had surrounded himself with, but in a child who had nothing to his name except an unshakable belief in doing what was right. It had changed him. He had always thought of charity as something distant, something to be handled through donations and formal gestures. But now, it felt personal. It was no longer just about writing checks. It was about seeing the people those checks were meant to help. It was about making sure kids like that boy were not forgotten, that they were given chances to rise above the circumstances they had been born into. Because now, he knew that greatness could come from anywhere. He had never expected a child to teach him that lesson, but he was grateful that he had learned it. And so, as the boy's life transformed, so did the businessman's. Weeks passed, and the city slowly moved on, as it always did. The story of the boy's bravery remained in the headlines for a while, inspiring countless others, but eventually it faded from the news cycle. But it did not fade from the hearts of those who had witnessed it. His story became something greater than just a moment in time. It became proof that courage had no size, no status, no limitations. It became a reminder that the choices we make, even the smallest ones, have the power to shape the course of our lives. The boy knew that his journey was just beginning. There would still be struggles, still be moments where doubt crept in, still be challenges he had yet to face. But he was no longer just surviving, he was living. And as he walked into his classroom, as he picked up his pencil and prepared to take the first step into a future he never thought possible, he carried with him the lesson that had changed everything. Sometimes, it only takes one moment of bravery to change the course of your life. That moment can come from anyone, no matter their size or circumstances.